In 1775, Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet stating that the freedoms of men can only be maintained by limiting the power of government. The pamphlet was called Common Sense, and today it still is common sense.
I'm Mark Zaccaria. This is Common Sense. Welcome back.
And I'm Ruth Zaccaria, sitting in again this week for regular host Allison Perry. As the new legislative session gets underway, we'll see old news come back to life now that lawmakers have the chance to enact bills again. We'll also see new bills filed as the jockeying for position on the Speaker's agenda cranks up again, in earnest. You can depend on Common Sense TV to provide you with the insight and analysis you'll need to keep up with what's happening on Smith Hill from the comfort of your own home. This week's show features an in-depth interview by State Representative Patricia Morgan. Pat will have Don Allen, a vocal opponent of Common Core, the federal education mandate. He will discuss the recent PARCC scores as well as other Common Core initiatives. Today's show will conclude with commentary on right to work in the Ocean State, brought to you by Portsmouth's own Jeff Richard. In between segments, Mark and I will pop back with the brief satiric looks at some of state government's more obvious folly. You'll know the question we'll be asking, are you kidding me? To get all that started, we'll bring you some analysis on the top news stories affecting Little Rhodey today. Mark?
Thanks, Ruth. This year is now 2016, and we are about to celebrate the 4th anniversary of the Rhode Island State Police investigation into the meltdown of the 38 Studios deal. Usually cited as the most respected arm of state government, the state police seem to have been doing an especially thorough job of getting to the bottom of the causes of this costly and embarrassing chapter in Ocean State history. Still, it would be nice if the findings of this Herculean effort could find their way to the public discourse sometime this year. It's true, Judge Michael Silverstein allowed for the release of tens of thousands of pages of evidence pertaining to 38 Studios from the state's suit against multiple defendants in the matter. All that documentation only illuminated the accounting details of the transactions which took place between the state and the various players. That tranche of paperwork shed no light on the motivations or the intent of the inner circle who cooked up this witch's brew in the spring of 2012 as that legislative session came to an end. The criminal investigation seems to have ground down to a glacial and possibly protective pace. I'm no expert on criminal investigations, of course, but it seems to me that such a probe should be concluded before the statute of limitations expires on any of the misdeeds it might uncover. It's true, the troopers conducting this investigation may well have encountered a litany of motions and stays that have compounded the consumption of time in this matter. Since Colonel Stone formed the unit in 1925, however, the Rhode Island State Police has had the integrity to maintain the confidentiality of its investigations while related civil actions were in process. The state troopers have also always had the gravitational influence in our state to see to it that they get the insider information they need to make those criminal probes successful. So it raises questions as to why this particular matter has taken so long. Those questions could be answered by a public airing of their findings, whether or not indictments came down as a result. Let's hope that the publication of these results can be released this year, and while there's still enough time for them to be of use to the House Committee on Oversight, which is also looking into the matter. If not, all those questions will attract even more attention and curiosity in the breach. Ruth?
Thanks, Mark. It seems that there can be deeper political intrigue in even the simplest transactions on Smith Hill. That's why some done deals are never actually done, just because they make sense from a management or profitability angle. Case in point, in the last session of the state legislature, the House, the Senate, and the governor all agreed to give the Rhode Island Public Transit Authority, RIPTA, the go-ahead to charge nominal fees to certain riders who had theretofore been given free passes. RIPTA's argument in favor of the token fees was that the system was losing money and would be forced to cut routes and personnel as a result. The additional income from elderly and disabled riders would allow the system to continue to offer more service to more discrete locations, making it easier on these riders to actually use public transportation. As I said, the matter passed routinely last year. RIPTA promptly announced that on July 1st, 2016, each ride taken by one of these customers would cost $1. That fare represents a 50% reduction in cost to these special needs customers, and it would provide the system the cash flow it needs. Everybody wins, right? Done deal. Not so fast. Now Pro-Joe staffer Patrick Allen reports in the paper that Senate President Teresa Paiva-Weed has been taking heat from constituents on what they regard as a fare hike from the former amount, $0. She is suddenly seized with a moral conviction that the fare should be reset to its former free status out of deference to the needs of this otherwise underserved population. RIPTA politely reminded the Senate President that without sufficient income from its operations, it would be forced to come hat in hand to her Finance Committee again. Meanwhile, House Speaker Nicholas Mattiello tried to manage the crisis by suggesting a compromise to 50 cents per qualifying ride. If we are to believe the RIPTA cost accountants, that's not enough to keep the system whole. Nor is it enough, in my opinion, to inoculate Paiva-Weed from her chronic attacks of giving away the store. What's really going on here, folks? If the fare increase was actually needed in order to maintain service levels, then the legislature shouldn't roll over when voters complain based only on the view of the problem from their own pocketbooks. In the Army, they call that a lack of leadership. What I call it is a microcosm of the problem we see throughout state government. No one takes a unified view of the overall problem and communicates to the public why we all have to pull together on this. Instead, they play a constant game of whack-a-mole, treating one symptom in a panic reflex without thinking about what other symptom that very treatment will cause to emerge. Ladies and gentlemen, things will just remain status quo until you and I start demanding actual leadership from our elected leaders. Mark?
Point made, Ruth. Here's another story with the same theme. Just as the laws of physics will be strictly enforced, so too will the laws of economics. For proof, we have only to look to neighboring Connecticut. Recently, Red Jenke, reporting in Investors Business Daily, took a look at some troubling emigration figures for the Constitution state. It seems that a review of U.S. Census figures shows that the state is losing high-income existing residents and only gaining new residents of lower income levels. In 2013, the last full year for which data are available, 95,000 Connecticut residents left for other states. The average gross income of that group was $112,000 per year, as opposed to the average of all taxpayers, $101,000. Worse yet, new immigrants to Connecticut numbered only 78,000 new taxpayers, and that pool had an average gross income of only $86,000 per year. So guess what's happening to our neighbor to the west? The Yankee Institute, a Hartford think tank, has documented a $3.8 billion erosion of that state's tax base just between 2011 and 2013. Last year's Connecticut state budget of $18 billion went into deficit just 4 months into the year. Why is that, folks? Well, because constantly increasing taxation on both business entities and their successful owners are being used to fund giveaway programs that are bad enough on paper, but worse in the real world since they're actually managed by government too. Sound familiar? Connecticut may be dead last among the 50 U.S. states in per capita growth of the income tax base between 2009 and 2015. But guess who was next to last? That's right, it's Little Rhody. If you stop paying your electric bill, they have to stop sending you the power. Our state, like our neighbors, is spending at increasing rates despite lower and lower regular income. That can't go on forever. And if the legislature's first indication of a problem is when the lights go out in the State House, they can't really call themselves good managers either. This year is an election year. Ladies and gentlemen, as voters, we have to start insisting on getting real leadership and good management in return for our votes. Ruth?
Thanks, Mark. Now, just before we see the first segment of Representative Patricia Morgan's interview on Common Core, I have reason to believe that someone is about to ask the burning question. Are you kidding me? Would you believe it if I told you that Rhode Island's Department of Transportation was back in the news again, but for the wrong reason? Sure you would. Are you kidding me? Pro-Joe staffer Alex Kuffner reported last week in the paper that federal judge Mary M. Lisi granted a motion from U.S. Attorney Peter F. Nerona that required a number of actions from RIDOT. It all had to do with the feds enforcing the requirement that the state be responsible for its roads. What a concept. Here's what RIDOT now has to do. First, pay a civil penalty for failing to clean and repair more than 25,000 storm drains and 3,800 catch basins that are responsible for allowing polluted runoff into environmentally endangered streams and wetlands. Second, conduct a first-ever inventory of the drainage infrastructure on the more than 1,100 miles of state roadways. Third, pay at least $112 million over the next 10 years to see to it that everything is operating properly and this long-standing pollution problem is abated. By the way, where's that money going to come from? And by the way, again, first ever list of the stuff they own? Like, duh! I guess that over the last 10 years, RIDOT has been doing just about nothing to take care of this protective system. Cool. I bring all this up simply to remind you that this is the same RIDOT that is slated to be the recipient of proceeds from the big bond, and which has already publicly stated that more than 90% of the money will not be spent on the maintenance of roads or bridges. This is all bound to turn out so well. Do we live in Rhode Island, or have we moved in with Alice in Wonderland? Are you kidding me?
Welcome to Common Sense Rhode Island. This is a program where we try to make sense out of the policies that affect your life and come up with common sense solutions. I'm Representative Patricia Morgan, and we have with us today Don Allen, who is a... Good morning, how are you?
I'm well, how are you?
Don is a small businessman, and he is the parent of 4 children in the Burrowville Public Schools. And he has done a lot of investigation in the Common Core standards and the PARCC test that the standards are built on, or the test is built on the standards.
That's correct, yeah.
Some real negative things came out this summer. Students finally took the PARCC test, and it was a real disappointment for us as a state, and for certain communities it was devastating to find out how poorly students did on this test. I'd like just to spend a little bit of time on this. I know you've really looked at the test and the standards, but you know, as a state, about 36% of our students are proficient, which means that 64% are not. That we can't fail that many kids. We can't fail to give them the education they need to have good, productive adult lives. If you look at certain communities, it gets even worse. Central Falls, 5% of the kids are proficient. Pawtucket, 14%. Providence, 10%. These are really bad numbers. I know you got involved in this because you care about kids getting good education. What's your impression of these test scores?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for having me on today.
Okay.
And Happy New Year.
I haven't finished grilling you yet, so maybe.
No, that's right. Well, we'll see how we end up
at the end of it, that's right.
That's okay. I look forward to it. My impression with the scores, first let me just say, there was some expectation of lower scores based on what PARCC had said to expect. So if we just go on their word saying, look, this is a new test based on new standards, you have take time to work out the kinks. So if you give them the benefit of the doubt that, okay, this is a new test, we have some learning curves and some kinks to work out, if you will, we were expecting lower scores based on their own admission.
Were we expecting that 90% of the kids in Providence would not be proficient in reading or math?
Well, certainly, I wouldn't expect so.
No.
What I do have in terms of feelings about the test and the standards that they're built on, I think helps to explain some of what we see in some of the results. Because as you'll find, we had an initiative in Burrillville. We had a huge opt-out percentage. We call it refusals, what we call it, because that's what we're doing, is essentially refusing the test. But that element of pushback trickled down through some of the other students who I don't believe took the test as seriously as they might have otherwise. So
yeah, and I know that you don't like the test, but for me, when we were in the General Assembly, I think it's 2 years ago, we had the kneecap, right, which was being used, I think, in a lot of schools as a diagnostic test. They could figure out, all right, students aren't learning decimals well, or this particular student can't get this particular concept, and they could go back and reteach.
Yes.
And so having that diagnostic test used as a test that was a graduation requirement, I thought, okay, there's a mismatch there. But at that time, we were assured as policymakers that the park would fill that test, would fill that void, that there needs to be some kind of standardized test that tells us whether students are learning or not, right? I mean, we can't keep just passing kids through the educational system and having them get out after 12 years of sitting there without the skills they need to be employed and to have good lives.
Right. So, no, I don't disagree with that premise. The challenge for me in agreeing with you is to overcome my issue with the standards themselves, which this test is supposed to
be built on.
So it's very difficult for me to get on the same page on the concept of an assessment until we address the underlying issue.
Okay.
So once we have crossed that threshold and that hurdle, then I would agree with you 100% that accountability is necessary throughout the system. Whether or not that is implemented from the federal government or whether we have our own statewide sort of assessment remains to be perhaps worked out. But
now, if you look at just the PARCC scores across the state, there are some communities where clearly the educational level of the parents, the income level is higher, and they did better than kids in Central Falls, Providence, where probably lower income, right? They probably are poor kids.
Socioeconomics means a lot.
So would you have different tests? Because every kid needs to get out there in the world and compete with one another, whether they came from a poor family or a rich family. They all have to get out there and compete for the same jobs. We don't have jobs for kids that came from poor families or ones that came from rich families, right?
Right. Everybody, there's a mandate. Public schools must educate everyone. So the goal is, and the job is to figure out how best to do that. Right. When you look at socioeconomic issues, clearly there are influences in lower socioeconomic situations that differ from families in wealthy communities. You can't get around that. And so those influences.
So is that a testing issue or a teaching issue?
Well, certainly, if you had a quality teacher to overcome those issues, you can certainly rely on that teacher to do those things. And that's really what you want, right? I mean, you want a teacher that can address the needs of their students and educate them according to their needs, as opposed to some mandate of certain things that have to be taught in a certain way, because every child learns in a different way. So the teacher's the one that can facilitate those adjustments and make a classroom a better place. So that's what I encourage, and I know trying to assess that on a test score is difficult to hold a teacher accountable for all of those things, but at the same time, that's where the rubber meets the road, right? I mean, good teaching comes from good teachers, Yeah. And that's really what we want,
from teachers
right?
knowing their craft
Right.
and the skills that they need. So when we look at the Common Core standards, you think that they've been developed without inappropriate to the ages of the kids, or inappropriate to the kinds of things they want them to learn, or both? Or
it's a combination of a few things. What we see with the earlier grades is that they are taught to do simple math in a number of different ways rather than instructing them and forcing them to learn and memorize certain concepts.
Sure.
And then the older grades...
1 + 1, 2 + 2,
right,
sure.
Right. And the older grades, they sort of lower the bar for the minimum standards and don't really have a provision to test for higher skills and higher math. So there's a combination of a few things that seem to not fit in appropriately with what education should be. So...
Boy, it looks like, to me, like you've read the entire standards and really, really thought about them. For you to be able to say from the first grade and the second grade to higher level that you see differences there. So, we're going to take a break right now.
Okay.
And do a Are You Kidding Me? But when we come back, I'd like to have what you see in the Common Core standards that concerns you.
Great.
Great.
In the news business, it is said that dog bites man is not a front page headline because it happens all the time. Man bites dog, on the other hand, that's front page above the fold because that's unusual. This week in the Providence Journal, we might just have seen the start of a story about Rhode Island bureaucracy that rises to that front page standard. DCYF is healing itself. Are you kidding me? Well, we here at Common Sense are cautiously optimistic. If you've heard anything about the checkered recent past of the state's Department of Children, Youth, and Families, you've heard the dog bites man tale of misuse of taxpayers' dollars for personal gain. Now, though, Jennifer Bogdan of the Journal reports that DCYF Interim Administrator Jamia McDonald is cleaning house. For real. Nice. It seems that one of the shortcomings of the department's Chafee-era management structure had been the creation of a network of private sector contractors whose job it was to oversee the subcontracts for actual services provided to DCYF clients. Ms. McDonald is changing that because there are regular employees of the department whose job descriptions say they do that. It's always a disappointment when bureaucracy seems to be blindly adding additional layers of overhead cost. Here, though, we could be seeing some recognition of the problems with the agency by the agency itself. We could also be seeing an administrator so intent on fixing her shop's problems that she's willing to buck the political system and actually cancel contracts that are already in place. No doubt, DCYF is rebuilding its own internal morale at the same time it's rebuilding a more efficient management structure. If that's what's really going on here, let's all stand back a ways and let the woman work. In the multicultural world of 2016, we may be seeing a state worker with both the chutzpah and the cojones to get this job done. Are you kidding me?
Welcome back to Common Sense. I'm Representative Patricia Morgan, and we have today with us Don Allen, who is a parent of 4 children, and as a parent of 4 children in public schools, you've become really, really involved in making sure your kids get a great education.
Yes.
And very concerned about the Common Core standards. You've done a whole lot more investigation of the standards than I have. Why are you concerned about them? Where do you think they fall down?
Well, I turned my attention to a few folks that have experience with standards writing and were very vocal against what they saw was happening with these Common Core standards. If my memory serves me right, there was about 28 or so people that wrote the standards. Very few of them had any real education background and no real standards writing history in their resumes. Mm-hmm. The validation committee that was set up to assess whether these standards were good or not were comprised again of people that didn't really have educational backgrounds. 2 in particular did.
So they weren't classroom teachers?
Correct, right. There was a few, I want to say 4 or 5 were on the standards writing team that had some classroom experience. I don't believe the elementary school years were represented properly. But someone like Sandra Stotsky, who wrote the English language arts standards for Massachusetts, or James Milgram, who was a mathematician who had history of writing math standards, both refused to sign off on these Common Core standards, saying, that they're lacking in many respects, and I turned to their analysis to understand, what is wrong with these standards, and then looked even further than that. There was a letter written back in 2010 by 400 early educational specialists that all had disagreements about these standards. So that was a red flag to me that people with that background have problems with these standards.
Can you tell me what some of their specific criticisms of the standards are?
From what I can tell, the early grades, they have designed the standards to make simple math concepts more challenging, I think, in an effort to, I'm sort of assuming that they're trying to get kids to think more about the math that they're doing. But what we're finding is that the time for that is later in life.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking 5, 6, 7 years of age. There's some brain development that has to go on first, right?
Right, they're saying learn your math.
Before you can get the complex.
You've got to learn your math facts. You have to know all of the basics like the back of your hand. Like if someone asks you what time it is, you know it. It doesn't interrupt your train of thought. If you're too confused about what the best way is to do math, by the time you get into algebra and higher math, if you're thinking still about how to approach the simple stuff, you're never going to master the higher level math. So those are some of the major complaints in the math.
There are just some things that you just have to know. I get that. All your facts, you just have to know them. Is it fun to learn them? Probably not, but you just have to.
Right, so you have to get through it, you have to memorize those things, and it becomes second nature. And so it doesn't interfere with what comes later. And they also push the requirement for Algebra 1 and 2 further along so that it actually makes it very difficult to get into a calculus course while still in high school. So once you find that these math skills start to play out, once you reach the high school level, the children are going to be very hard pressed to get into the kind of courses required for STEM careers and things like that. So those were his major objections to the math side. The math side.
So he didn't think they were correlated according to age, brain development, and then just the flow of them.
Yeah, so later on
there was a nice progression.
Yeah, the higher level math is not necessarily going to be attainable, or for children thinking of going into the STEM careers. So, that was the math side. Sandra Stotsky did a little bit more with the English language arts, identifying this replacement of your traditional literature with some of the like reading manuals or other informational texts.
Ooh, I don't even do that today.
So, I mean, I don't know that makes it easier for children to learn how to read when you're reading something like that, as opposed to a classic literature to understand the language. You know, so
a love of just words is a nice thing to have.
So there were some objections by some really smart people that caught my attention, and that's what got me involved essentially.
All right, so the standards were developed by people who were chosen by, Washington, D.C., and by different corporations who were giving money to the effort.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Essentially,
but without a lot of classroom teacher input. So there wasn't a group of first grade teachers from the Northeast sitting around and saying, these are appropriate to kids in the first grade. They can learn these things. They can master them. These were kind of imposed from some higher level, federal level.
Yeah, there were corporate interests. Achieve Inc. was one of the parties involved. The Council for Chief State School Officers and the National Governors Association were essentially the three groups that came together to write these standards. David Coleman was, who's now moved on to the SAT to redevelop that test, sort of oversaw the standards writing process. And that's exactly what they did. They brought in people from academia and testing companies, so that's where they came from.
Yeah, I have read some of the standards, I'll be honest with you, and I look at them and I say, can't they just say this in plain English so I know what they're trying to get, right? They're just... I imagine teachers are sitting there going, okay, all right, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Right? In terms of these little bodies that are in front of me and their enthusiasm for learning, the language is just really difficult. It's not in plain language that people can just grab and understand.
I think Sandra Stotsky spelled it out pretty nicely when she said, all they did was take a number of standards and try to jam them all into one, and she's like, they're not even writing good sentences.
Yeah.
So
they're not.
It's a challenge, it really is.
All right, so we have these standards that we're not really sure do the trick for our kids, that they're not age appropriate, they're not content appropriate, they don't move the kids according to brain development and physical development and all this. But now we've taken a test, and we've developed a test based on these standards. Is that right? That's what the PARCC test is.
The PARCC test is. So it creates certainly a problem. I sort of refer to it as, putting shutters on a house built on a poor foundation. I mean, the shutters you think that look good, but what good are they if the house is falling down? One of the differences when it comes to the testing component, where you look at standardized tests that are typically administered, they're usually done by a third party. Mm-hmm. The difference with the PARCC and Smarter Balance, which is the other consortia, a number of states got together and made contracts to develop these tests, but the state was responsible for accepting the standards. They develop the test, they implement the test, they set the cut scores, and then report on the cut scores.
Who does?
This is all overseen by the state, Rhode Island Department of Education, implementing these.
So our own Department of Education said, yep, we like the standards, yep, we like the test, and then
they administer the test, then they create the cut scores. So each state
So what do you mean by a cut score?
A cut score is where you determine what the proficiency level is. So there's not necessarily a firm...
So our cut score could be different than it is in Ohio, or?
That's what I've been led to believe, and I think that takes a little bit further investigation, because it doesn't make a lot of sense. If you're really trying to compare one to the other, I mean, how do you do that if the states have their own criteria for making those decisions?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we have another one right now. Are you kidding me?
Since taking office just 1 year ago, Rhode Island Governor Gina Raimondo has conspicuously increased her staff of public relations professionals. You'd think all that extra madman muscle would make her messaging pasteurized, processed, purified, decaffeinated, disinfected, and fully filtered against all gaffes. Sadly, a major PR fail last week suggests she may not be getting the value for money from her new corps of press agents. Are you kidding me? Well, what conclusion would you draw when a formal Freedom of Information Act request is made on the most inflammatory issue on the table right now, and it gets answered with a 134-year-old map rather than anything like current documentation? The issue is the big bond and the 17 to 22 proposed toll gantries that will collect the money to repay it. The governor's claims that large tractor trailers alone will supply the $60+ million per year to pay the VIG are being ridiculed. It is naive at best to think existing traffic patterns will continue with no response on the part of business to increased costs for doing so. The FOIA request from a major political opponent of the plan mandates an administrative response. Still, it does seem tone-deaf for the governor's team to send along an 1882 map of the city of Providence as a working document for this proposed program. With so many new PR weenies on the team, it is hard to think that this release was anything other than intentional. The use of the meaningless old map had to have been discussed before sending it out. When combined with the continued refusal of the administration to say anything about the tolling locations or amounts, it should surprise no one that the move is regarded as an intentional insult. Clearly, the governor has written off the votes of Republicans in the House. It may well be that she doesn't need them to ram this package through. Her Democrat colleagues in both chambers should take note, however. Some fine day, the governor may not need their votes either. Just this week, the 2016 legislative session opened with a tumultuous rally at the State House, which clearly signaled the public's distaste for 30 years of indebtedness that would not even result in 10 years of maintenance. I thought this was all about fixing bridges, Governor Raimondo, not burning them. Are you kidding me?
Welcome back. to Common Sense Rhode Island. I'm Representative Patricia Morgan, and we have with us today Don Allen, who is a small businessman and a very concerned parent of 4 children who are in the Burrillville Public Schools. Don, we were talking about the Common Core standards and your sense that they are flawed. I don't disagree with your analysis of that. But we have these standards now that the Department of Education has accepted, and we've built a test on them, right? This standardized test.
Yes. Yeah.
If they're flawed standards, or if they're standards that don't adequately or appropriately meet the educational development of students, I guess you've been saying pretty loudly and pretty clearly that the PARCC test then can't possibly give us what we need for students.
Right. I would agree 100%. Even if we saw good scores, that tells us that we've been able to do what the standards asked us to do. But if we don't feel that what the standards are asking us to do, does it even matter that we got a good score? That's the nature of my analysis of this whole thing. So that's the reason why I've been very vocal and outspoken about the test itself, is because what we're trying to do is say, look, this test is not worth the effort to pursue any further, because what we really need to do is step back, reassess what standards we have. So we're getting the threats now from the federal government that we need to have participation rates that exceed 95% or meet that 95% participation, or there's going to be the potential threat of withholding Title I money. So that,
which hurts the kids that need it the most, but.
So it makes it very difficult to stand your ground and say this is what we need to do when they have those threats. But at the same time, we have to understand how much money we're investing in pursuing these tests to say, well, if we're not complying with the testing, how much of an impact is that cut to our budget going to be? You can make those sort of monetary analysis as well.
Let's not go down there yet. But are you against all standardized testing?
No, not at all. I mean, even ECAP, as a general sense, gave the districts actionable feedback about, as a general sense, where are we lacking? Because
it was a diagnostic tool. It was a good one.
It is, and it's again a third-party administered test. So it's not something that has the appearance of a conflict of interest at the very least. I mean, at the worst, what I seem to see is the states having these direct involvements in the testing as a problem. And as a side note too, a Missouri judge just last year said that the Smarter Balance Consortia was unconstitutional because the Constitution prohibits the states from entering into agreements with each other. It's a constitutionally prohibited activity. So the actual testing consortia may not be indeed constitutional. So there's a whole other host of issues with this test in particular.
But honestly, I took standardized tests. I think every parent took standardized tests when they were in school. I don't have anything against a standardized test. It has to be a valid test, and I think that's where you're coming from. It has to be valid, based on valid criteria. I think if you don't have some standardized something out there, then you don't have the accountability, right? You could have kids reading at the 4th grade level and saying, hey, they've mastered it, we're good. But then when those kids go out into the world and try to get jobs, they're not going to succeed. So how do we make this test valid? How do we make sure that there is accountability for children, for parents, for teachers in our education system? Because you need to drive accountability. I was a teacher. I believe in education. I really do. I think without it, kids don't have the lives that they need to have. That being said, without accountability in the system, kids get into high school and it's all boring, and they'll sit back and they won't do the work, and teachers get burned out. What's your solution here?
Well, I mean, there's a number of steps I think that we have to take. I mean, accountability has been a problem
Can
for
we
many
take
years.
this test and rework it, or do we have to throw the whole thing out and start again?
Well,
Because every time we start again, we're losing time,
Well, we're definitely losing time.
and that's lives.
But
And-
you have to make a decision. I know a lot of teachers are doing their best to do what they feel is right for their students.
Absolutely.
And I've talked to a lot of them that says, we're being asked and required to do these things, but I also do these things because these are right. And so we can't have that dynamic in the school system. That just can't continue. And unfortunately, if we're going to use a flawed test based on flawed standards to say that you're not performing as a school or as a teacher, you're setting yourself up for additional failures, because those teachers will be burned out and they will be frustrated and they will leave the profession. And they will replace them with those who will just follow those rules and not really think about what's best for students. They'll think what's most appropriate for making sure that we adhere to these standards, which, again, I really feel are inappropriate. So you can't. I mean, I know you lose time, but in the real world, if you made a bad decision, you don't keep going down the road.
Yeah,
without
I agree
making
with you on that,
At
and
some
yet,
place, you have to make an
if there's
adjustment.
a 4-year gap before you get that next test, that's 4 years of students who aren't thriving, who aren't.
Well, I have to give some credit to the teachers that are really trying to make the difference and make the effort to say, look, we're working, as parents and school committee members and Department of Ed, that we're trying to make these changes. In the meantime, keep doing what you know works, and we have to give the credit to the teachers where it's due. I mean, everybody knows there's good and bad teachers and so forth, but we have to try and right the ship. You can't turn a tanker around in a.
But if you look at Providence, 90% of the students tested as not being proficient. 90%. How do we, I mean, there has to be something worked into the system, because that's a number that should be alarming to everybody. That's 90% of our young people getting out of school without the tools they need to be successful.
I'd be more interested in knowing perhaps what kneecap looked like a few years back, and using something that I feel is a more valid assessment based on standards that I think were more appropriate at the time, to give us a better gauge. Because
So you would go back to kneecap while we develop the next level test?
Oh, I think so. I mean, we're not that far down this Common Core road where the old standards are not that far away.
Sure.
I'm not saying that those old standards didn't need improvement. They probably, there's always room for improvement. But I really look toward what Massachusetts did because of, again, the accountability was there. We saw the test scores. We know that they performed.
They were #1 in the country for educational performance of their students, right?
You would think they would have maybe asked for their input when they wrote the standards, but so it tells you a lot about where these standards came from and who's really benefiting from them. It's not the students and the teachers.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Okay. So we wouldn't have to, I guess I want to make sure that in the meantime there is accountability to something, because students need that accountability, their parents need it, and educators need it as well. So there is, we could go back, you're right, it's only 2 years, we could continue to use that standard while we develop something that is more valid.
And look at the grade books, look at the administration and see if they've done what they're supposed to do in making sure that the children are being taught.
Okay, great. And we'll be right back.
As of late last month, the Federal Internal Revenue Service is now authorized to confiscate your passport as well as your assets if, in its sole determination, you owe Uncle Sam money. Are you kidding me? The law, passed in December, stipulates a delinquent amount of federal taxes of at least $50,000 as the threshold for this action. But the regulations on how to implement this are left up to the agency, which, of course, also polices itself. If IRS agents suspect that you'll soon owe $50,000, might that be cause to forcibly restrict your authority to travel? Many taxpayers who were slow-walked by the IRS during the Tea Party targeting scandal would say yes. What does it say about the relationship between the government and the people it is sworn to protect when it appears to think that a relatively small arrearage makes John or Jane Doe an immediate flight risk. By the way, people in a number of states that have not upgraded their picture IDs to federal standards now need a passport to fly domestically. Where is government of the people, for the people, and by the people in all of this? In a December 23rd editorial, Investors Business Daily strongly suggested that the IRS cannot be trusted. Do you have any expectation that this new rule will be implemented fairly and evenly by the IRS? Do you think something as innocent and explainable as a computer glitch could flag you for this treatment, while someone else from a more favored demographic would have it overlooked? Many would agree that the IRS is several steps outside the frame. It will never be wrangled back into a proper corral, though, unless you and I get together and vote to have it happen. What odds are the London bookies giving on that taking place? Are you kidding me?
Welcome back. I'm Representative Patricia Morgan, and we have with us Don Allen, who is a very concerned parent in Burrillville, Rhode Island, and have been an activist, an education activist. And it's not because you want to be against something, it's because you are there for kids, right? I see that, right? You're very concerned that our children are not getting the education that they need to be thriving, successful adults. And that's the tragedy that is happening in Rhode Island right now. When we look at these scores from the PARCC test, may be flawed, whether it's flawed or not, when you see that 64% of the kids are not proficient, something is wrong. And you know, as a representative, I have the business community constantly coming to me and saying, we have jobs that go looking because we can't find people with the basic skills, and they're talking basic skills of reading, math, thinking. They can't find people to fill these. So what is your ultimate goal? What would you like to see happen? I know that you got parents, you led the charge in Burrillville for people to question the PARCC exam and whether it was valid or not. What's your ultimate goal?
Well, ultimately, I think, obviously, is a better educational system or set of standards. But I think the way to accomplish that is to bring it back to a more localized control. I can point out one example. I mean, the school committees in our state and throughout the country have a lot more autonomy and power than I think they're led to believe. So, for example, in New Hampshire, one town just decided we're not going to do Common Core anymore, and so be it with the consequences. So I think those types of initiatives are important to try and get local communities more involved in education.
But if they don't do Common Core, I mean, I would never want it to get to the point where in Providence they say, well, our kids are poor, so they can't learn as good as the kids in East Greenwich or Barrington. I would never want it to be where they dumb down curriculum or dumb down standards, because whether you're poor or not, I think you can learn.
Right, and teachers need to inspire. I mean, I go back to the Teacher of the Year who in New York school systems, John Taylor Gatto. He taught in Harlem for years, and he was recognized at how successful he was at teaching students of all socioeconomic backgrounds, and so it can be done. And so I really think that you need to make sure that you are getting good quality teachers in the classroom to do the type of teaching, and not have these mandates from the federal government that say that you have to have these certain standards and you have to do things a certain way, because, I mean, yes, everyone needs to know certain things, and we all agree on that, but to suggest that some outside entities that come up with these standards know better than what a local community could do in conjunction with other communities. I'm not saying that any one community would have the monopoly on what's best, but work together. I mean, there's nothing stopping us from using what works.
So you would support having some kind of standard, some kind of standardization in the skills that kids need to move on in their grades and actually graduate. You'd accept that there should be some kind of a standard for everybody.
Oh, wait, there's nothing wrong with that. We've always had some level of standards, right? I mean, everybody pretty much knows what those are. We don't need to have an outside authority saying so, but at the same time, adopting a set of standards, even if they are common to most states for the basics, there's nothing wrong with that. But if they're written in a way that is, either age inappropriate or not incomprehensible, I mean, how is that helpful to students or teachers?
Right.
So we have to be very careful about, some of the underlying issues with how these test scores are going to be used in terms of what they want to do with schools. This newest computer-based education system where students do all of their learning online. I mean, how much time are students supposed to spend in front of a TV screen and just be, learning in that fashion? I mean, the interaction between teachers is so important. And
I really think so, too. I know that the technology is taking over and teachers are posting many classroom exercises on their websites
tool.
And stuff. It's a great tool, but nothing replaces the personal contact of a teacher, right? When they can see that kid puzzling over something and they go over and say, okay, what's going on here, right?
Right.
Nothing is more important than that personal touch. So I still believe that there needs to be standards. I don't think maybe Common Core isn't the right one.
I'm not getting away from them at all. No, I wouldn't ever suggest that.
If you don't have that goal that everybody has to have these, and they have to be stretch goals, in fact, then...
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, I don't know if I sound like a broken record when I say, look to Massachusetts. I mean, again, states were put in a bad situation when the economic downturn happened in 2008. And the federal government took advantage of that and told states that you would, be able to get your stimulus money as long as you accept the standards that hadn't even been written yet. What did the states say? Well, yes, we need the money. It's a difficult situation. And so we got ourselves into a bind, So Massachusetts is finally making efforts. The citizens of that state have spoken loudly. 60,000 signatures on the ballot this fall that Common Core standards will be removed, and I would imagine they're going to go back to the standards that made them the best in the country. They had the accountability, and students succeeded.
Yeah, they were number one, and I believe once they put Common Core in, they actually fell.
To fall. That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, it says a lot about what, because Sandra Stotsky's pointed out, she says, I didn't close the achievement gap. She's like, I raised everybody up.
Raised everybody up.
Raised everybody up. I mean, isn't that what the goal should be? I mean, closing the gap might be okay unless you're bringing the top down to close that gap.
That's right.
And that's the last thing we want.
That's not where you want to go, because everybody deserves
a good education.
They do. They do. I mean, I sound like a broken record. You're sounding like a broken record. I'll sound like one. Without education, to break any kind of poverty cycle, to get ahead in life, you have to have education. You have to have knowledge. And if we're failing kids, 90% of the kids in Providence, what are we doing to our state, to them, to their families, to our workforce? I mean, our companies. It's a downward spiral, and we have to figure it out. So, all right, so what do you wish? We got 2016.
Well, I can say that this year my name will appear on the ballot for school committee in the town of Burrillville. So I'm hoping that that's one step that I can take, at least locally, to make a difference. I'm hoping that we can watch what happens in Massachusetts and see that they get rid of these standards, and that will send a message loud and clear to the rest of the country that if Massachusetts is getting and doing away with these standards, then we should really be paying attention, because they're clearly our problems. And take a page out of their book, and hopefully that could translate to some changes in our state.
At the state level, sure.
That maybe we could adopt something similar to what they have adopted in Massachusetts, assuming they go back to their original standards, and use that as a template to build for a better future for our kids.
Well, that's a really good note, and I'm going to leave our viewers with that. Wish you all a good 2016, and thank you very much for coming.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
Now, we here in Little Rhodey are getting ready to put our legislators back to work. And we all wonder what will be on the agenda for 2016. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand what is wrong in Rhode Island, but it does take a really smart person to decide how to make things a little better. Now, I have a hard time deciding how our single-party state stays in business at all. Now, the idea of putting up tolling gantries to get the trucking industry to fix our roads and bridges is about the dumbest idea I can think of. Now, it has to come from the unions that want to get more union dues for their leadership team. Now, if you really want to get unhappy, review the salaries of the state's union administrators. It is appalling how much the taxpayers are spending on union salaries. Now, we hear constantly that Little Rhode Island is in the bottom percentile of every important comparative statistic, business climate being one of the most notable. An article in the Wall Street Journal written by the CEO of, quote, America for Prosperity, and his Wisconsin state director is worth mentioning again as we approach this next election cycle. It seems that Wisconsin has become the 25th state to vote itself into the right-to-work world. As reported, these states that have gone the way of right to work are prospering significantly more than the rest of us. Now you ask, what is right to work? And why should we be thinking about doing that kind of thing here? Now, the short answer is a worker cannot be forced to be in a union if they do not want to be, and they don't have to pay union dues if they don't want to. Now, the South in our country seems to be the champion of right to work. Now, we Northerners don't seem to have gotten the same message. Now, who cares? Well, let's take a quick look at the numbers. After Michigan went right to work, total union membership fell by 48,000 the first year, even as the total state employment grew. When Wisconsin went right to work in 2011, nearly 70% of the state's 70,000 state employees left the union. The AFT lost 50% and the NEA lost 30%. So what is the economic consequence of right to work? Now, the same Wall Street Journal article reported on a new Daimler plant being built in Charleston, South Carolina, joining a BMW plant in the state with 10,000 workers. Why did Mercedes-Benz move its headquarters to Atlanta from New Jersey? The answer is right to work. Let's do some math. Let's compare Rhode Island to South Carolina, 2013 versus 2014. We will use numbers provided by that good government organization called the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That august governmental organization states that in 2013, Little Rhodey employed 459,000. Of that number, 16.9% were in unions. In 2014, the employed numbers dropped to 453,000, and the union membership dropped to 15.1%. During that same period in South Carolina, the employed numbers went from 1,855,000 up to 1,884,000. Now, the union membership numbers dropped from 3.7% to 2.2%. So while Rhode Island lost 6,000 workers, the South Carolinian Gamecockers added 29,000. Wonder where else they came from besides Rhode Island in its lovely winter weather. I just helped my sister pack up to move from the Cape to her new home in the Tampa Bay area of Florida. She is joining up with all the other New Englanders moving out. We know that Rhode Island lost enough of its middle and upper middle class residents to put our second congressional House seat in jeopardy. And who did we get to move here? Well, those who know that as soon as they cross the line, they can go on welfare. So the people who are leaving are being replaced by immigrants costing us money. I think it is time for our legislators to get their act together and do a better job. Start right away to get rid of the impediments to serious growth. If it is business as usual, the legislature will wait until the last days of the session to pass a bunch of bad bills that will have no benefit for the future of the state. We have got to get rid of the union influence in this state. So I'm leaving you now with this thought. If the mayor of New York City had not decided in 1958 to allow the city workers to unionize so that he would get a huge voting block, and if President John Kennedy had not allowed federal workers to unionize in 1962, would we be in the fiscal mess we seem to be perpetually trying to get out of? Thank you for watching, and God bless.